Okay, so welcome to video 2 on academic journal article analysis. So by the time you come to this video and are ready to watch this video and look at how I demonstrate my particular interpretation and analysis of this paper, you will have watched already video 1. You will have read this article and conducted your own analysis in line with video 1. And then you'll be ready to watch this video. So we're going to look at this article, a very nice article from the Journal of Marketing by Matthew Thompson on human brands. And this paper investigates antecedent conditions for consumers' attachment to celebrities. So this is just what I'm going to do is go through step by step how I interpreted the paper. As with most things in marketing, there's no right and wrong way to do this. Everybody's interpretation is subjective. Everybody notices different things from academic papers, and that's why if you ever come to submit a paper for publication, it'll go to 3 different reviewers plus the editor, all of whom generally have quite a different take on the paper. So overall, what the purpose of this is really to see whether you've been able to extract the key pieces of information from the paper. So you would do this if you were wanting to help you answer, say, your own research question, or whether you're simply conducting an assignment and you want to cite this paper. You want to be able to learn how to read papers of this level and pick out those elements that are important. And this doesn't always necessarily mean reading the entire paper from start to finish, although I have done for the purpose of this video. Okay, so moving on, we come to the first question, and that's just when you, I've got the paper in front of me, so I'm going to be looking at this paper while I'm talking to you. What do we sort of understand about the author? What is the author trying to do here? What are his or her intentions? In this case, we notice that it's a single author, Matthew Thompson, and what is he bringing to the Journal of Marketing? What is he trying to do, or what is he achieving with this paper? Is it something new? And indeed, it is new, what he brings. And he conducts 3 different studies to help explain the construct of human brand attachment strength. And more generally, what he looks at is why are consumers attached to celebrities, which is a more general way of referring to human brands, although you will find his definition, which personally I find a little bit wishy-washy, is his own definition of what human brands are, but you can extract that from the paper quite easily. And his overall view, or the big picture that he's portraying here, is if firms can get to grips with what's going on here, firms are going to find a new way, so something novel, a way of building up consumer-based brand equity, which is hugely important for firms. So in that sense, this paper is of great value in terms of practical implications. Okay, so how do we approach the article? What are we sort of thinking about when we read this article? Well, for the purpose of this video, I pretended that we were conducting research, say, on consumer brand relationships. So whether you're writing a dissertation or an essay, or thinking about an exam question that is about consumer brand relationships, this is sort of the general approach that I took to investigating this paper. So if we're thinking about our own research, and we must think about what we're trying to achieve when we read a paper and analyse a paper, what do we notice? Well, it seems that we're being drawn in here to the construct of attachment, and indeed attachment strength, remembering, of course, attachment is different from attachment strength. And we're looking at those antecedents and those antecedent conditions, i.e., what causes people to become attached to brands, or in this case, to human brands. And it builds on a vast literature of attachment theory, and we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail as we progress through the video. And there's often something also there that is perhaps an element of surprise, or something that you hadn't really thought about before, which is also very useful. And that is this idea of a human brand, and understanding what this means and how this differs from the idea of a celebrity brand endorser. So the author goes into that in a little bit of detail, but there's certainly potential there to explore this if you're a researcher in more detail. But for our purposes, consumer brand relationships, and here we've got a paper that's going to shed some light on attachment and attachment strength. Okay, so we read the article, and we read it through, and we see the different sections that we would expect with an article such as this. And we note there are two specific sections. One's conceptual foundation, which is one way, I suppose, of labeling a literature review, but it's basically the literature foundation for the paper. And then there's the hypotheses section, which lays out the hypotheses for the paper. So we can see quite clearly that the author aims to test hypotheses. And then we go on to the methodology, results, and discussion. And what's slightly different with this paper is that there are 3 studies. So we have 3 methodology sections, 3 results sections, and 3 discussion sections. So it's up to you at what stage in your analysis you want to look at all of those in detail. But the rest of the paper follows this sort of fairly typical format. Okay, so we've talked about this idea in video 1 of reading and thinking, and when we're reading an article, what are we thinking about? And we don't want, none of us ever just jump in and start reading a paper such as this from start to finish. Instead, we look at the abstract, say we look at the abstract and we look at the conclusion. And what I find here, and the bullet points that you can see here, are all extracted. This is all information that I have extracted simply from the abstract and the conclusion. So it looks at why consumers develop attachments to human brands. We know that it's 3 studies and that it takes the mixed methods approach. It offers up some new insights into reasons for attachment. It also suggests that attachment strength could be indicative of consumer brand relationship strength. So that sets off alarm bells for us, because our research, say, is in consumer brand relationships. So that is interesting. And it suggests specifically the importance of interaction between consumers and human brands. So the key here is interaction. So in other words, there needs to be close proximity. This is not something that can be done with distance. And that is purely from the abstract and the conclusion. It's up to you whether you want to start getting into each of the 3 discussions which are attached to each study. So you can make that call when you want to go into that. But you can see here that we've extracted quite a lot already, just based on our reading and our thinking. So let's go now through section by section and see what we found there. And what you'll see in red in the next few slides is what we were able to ascertain from the introduction. We were able to figure out the why, and that is to extend understanding of consumer relationships with firms or brands or human brands. The research problem is, why do consumers develop strong attachments to human brands, i.e. what causes those attachments, and those are called antecedents. And what else does it sort of go on to do? Just, there's often a central focus, but there might also be sort of another focus. And what the author is trying to do here is explain to managers, in terms of managerial implications, what goes into building emotional bonds with consumers. So I then went on to look at the literature review and looked at what the background is into the research, and no big surprises here. It all comes from attachment theory, relationship theory. It draws on some of the interpersonal relationship theory that is often used in brand relationships, drawing on the work more often than not of Susan Fournier's seminal paper. It touches upon, well, not touches upon, it goes into quite a lot of detail in terms of human needs and motivation theory. What is it that human beings need on a daily basis? What are the kind of things that they draw upon in their relationships? What do they seek in their relationships? And here the author identifies autonomy, relatedness, and competence as being the three human needs. What has been done before? Well, there's a lot of research on consumer brand relationships, no surprises there, and the significance of attachment to various objects and people, brand attachment theory, human needs, and the constructs which have been required to strengthen attachment. So a lot of this has been done before at one level or another, and the author does a great job of drawing upon all of those literatures and bringing them into his background and analysis. So what is the research trying to achieve, or what does it achieve? It looks at why consumers develop strong attachment to human brands. That's the main research question. And then the research sub-questions ask, is it that the more a person perceives a human brand as fulfilling autonomy needs, relatedness, and competent needs, the more intensely attached he or she will be to the human brand? So that is what the hypotheses set out to test. Is this the case? Is it true or is it not true? And I haven't repeated the hypotheses here, but if you want to pause the video, you can now go to page 107 of the article and read through hypotheses 1 to 3. You can then see that study 2 does not test any hypotheses by itself. It simply complements study 1. And study 3 tests hypothesis 4, which you will find on page 113. So feel free to read those while the video's on pause if you like, and then go on to the next couple of sections before we wrap up. So data collection, very nicely and clearly laid out as to how the author sampled, how he created his sample, what his sampling frame was, and more often than not, as is the case here, the author used 164 undergraduate students randomly selected in study 1. 25 undergraduate students were recruited for a $5 reward in study 2, and then 107 adults were recruited in a different way to extend the context and to use a different sampling frame in study 3, and the author recruited these from online communities. So you can see that study 3 set out to say, okay, this happens with undergraduate students in study 1, which had its limitations, and therefore we're going to conduct another study to show whether this works in a different population and a different sample. Okay. So the methods used, what do we note? Mixed methods we used, which were surveys and interviews. Was it appropriate? This is, again, subjective. In my opinion, I'm not sure that study 2 necessarily brought anything of great significance to the study. Others would argue that it was essential in that the author wanted to show the differences and similarities between what was found in the qual study versus the quant studies. Were there any limitations? Yes, indeed, there were in study 1 in terms of the types of human brands that were self-selected because of the age range and the demographic of students. But this limitation was very cleverly overcome in study 3, so that in itself is quite interesting. So, what did the authors find? Here we go. What happens in terms of the results? Study 1, you can see that basically hypothesis 1, 2, and 3A and 3B were tested. It was found that hypothesis 1 and 2 and 3B was supported, but 3A was rejected. And you can see here that the dependent variable was the attachment strength, and ARC were the constructs that were tested as independent variables. Okay, so let's move on to study 2. And this, as you know, was the qualitative study. Questions were posed to test the responsiveness of human brands. And indeed, this was shown to provide correlational support for hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2. But bearing in mind, this was a qualitative study. And 48% showed evidence of autonomy, so that's the A of the ARC. 60% showed evidence of relatedness, which is the R of ARC. And only one response showed evidence of competence, which is the C in ARC. So we see a lot of similarities here between what was shown quantitatively in study 1. And then finally, study 3, hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2, and hypothesis 3B were accepted, and hypothesis 4, which was specifically tested here in study 3, was rejected. You'll note that the items used to measure the constructs, as in study 1, were all adapted from previous studies, so there was no new measures used here. These have all been measured in this way before. And there you can see that I've laid out for you what I found to be the most centrally relevant findings. So finally, we can look at what the key takeaways were. So what was this paper about in the end? So from the theoretical implications, it can be shown that what the author found here mirrors some previous work, interestingly qualitative work. Also particularly key, it was found that human brand attachments are not as strong as initially thought, and should probably be best viewed as supplementary types of attachments rather than solo attachments. The author also says that the quantitative methods provide a perspective which was not necessarily visible from the qualitative study that he conducted. So therein lies his argument for why he conducted both quantitative and qualitative. And I think the research implications for practitioners are very good and very powerful. And I think herein really lies the strength of the paper, and that is provides a lot of very useful insights to practitioners who are looking to build relationships with consumers, and how perhaps they can use a human brand to enable that relationship or to facilitate that relationship. But it's worth noting that interaction is particularly key here, and that this is not something that can be done from afar. There needs to be this close proximity. And human brands must be seen as being authentic, which again is not surprising. They have to be seen to be really caring or being really part of that relationship. And the author uses a very nice example in the paper of Ellen DeGeneres, and how she comes across as somebody who is not just acting the part, but really wants to build relationships with people. And then it looks at the idea and the differences between the idea of a straightforward human brand versus what other companies do, which is to use celebrities as endorsers of their brands, which are, so that's what's interesting, is the human brand versus the celebrity endorser. So you can see there are a lot of key insights there for practitioners. So that's the end of the video. I hope that you found it useful. I hope that you found that perhaps some of the things that you found in your analysis were similar to the ones that have been shown here, but also that perhaps you had a different interpretation or a different take on the paper. And that is what about critical analysis is all about. Is it's about different things